You outsourced cybersecurity. The liability stayed on your desk. New York's regulator put it in writing. Hire a vendor. The responsibility stays yours. You think your vendor is the risk. It's the vendor your vendor hired, the one you've never heard of. Same regulator fined the last firm millions. Yours signs the form in April. Let's be precise about what happened, because the framing is everything. In October, the New York Department of Financial Services issued guidance on third-party service providers. Not a press release, not a warning shot. A written statement of what examiners now expect, and the core line is brutal in its simplicity. You can hand the work to a vendor. You cannot hand them the responsibility. That sounds like compliance housekeeping. It isn't. Because every regulated firm runs on vendors now. Cloud, AI, fintech, the platforms that touch your data and move your money. You signed contracts that said the vendor carries the risk. The regulator just told you those contracts don't do what you think they do. So here's the question that should make you uncomfortable. If your vendor fails tomorrow, who does the regulator come for? Start with how this works in practice, because the mechanism matters more than the rule. A covered entity hires a third-party provider. Standard. The contract has the language everyone's contract has. The vendor maintains controls. The vendor carries liability. Indemnification flows downstream. Legal signed off. The board was told the risk was transferred, but transfer to a vendor is an operational arrangement. It is not a legal one. The work moved. The accountability didn't. Part 500 is explicit about it. The covered entity remains responsible for the security of its information systems and non-public data, including the parts a third party operates. The regulator doesn't recognize "we outsourced that" as a defense. There's no clause in the rule that lets responsibility leave the building when the work does. And here's where it stops being abstract. NYDFS said examinations have already identified gaps in due diligence, in contractual safeguards, in ongoing monitoring, in senior verification. This isn't a hypothetical exposure they're warning about, it's a pattern they're already finding. So what does the regulator actually require you to prove? Hold that, because the answer is harder than the question. Because here's the part the contract never told you. The document you signed to transfer the risk is the same document the regulator will use to prove you kept it. This is the non-delegation mechanism, and it's the spine of the whole episode. You assumed hiring a competent vendor reduced your liability. The regulator's position is the opposite. Hiring a vendor created a new thing you now have to prove you did. Not that the vendor is secure, that you verified the vendor is secure, in writing, on demand. That's the answer to what you have to prove. 4 things. You did risk-based due diligence before you signed. Your contract carries real safeguards, breach notification, encryption, controls on subcontractors, limits on how your data gets used, especially by AI vendors. You monitored the vendor continuously, not once at onboarding, and a senior officer verified all of it, because the rule says compliance can't be outsourced to the very vendor you're supposed to be checking. Think about the last firm this regulator went after. Delta Dental. NYDFS fined them $2.25 million over the paperwork they couldn't produce about their own systems. This is that same test, aimed one layer out. Not, is your house in order? Can you prove you checked someone else's house? The one you can't walk into? In plain terms, if an examiner asked today, could you hand over the file showing you verified your vendor's controls? Most firms can't. That gap is the liability. But it doesn't stop at the vendor you chose. Here's where the exposure stops being containable. Your vendor has vendors. The cloud provider you hired runs on a subprocessor. That subprocessor uses another. The company that can sync you isn't the one on your contract. It's the one your vendor hired, that you never chose, never vetted, and in most cases, have never heard the name of. NYDFS named this directly, fourth-party risk. The accountability doesn't stop at the edge of your vendor list. It follows the data, and it compounds because everyone leans on the same handful of providers. When one sub-processor fails, it doesn't fail for one firm. It fails for everyone downstream of it at once. Correlated, systemic, invisible until it isn't. Now hold the most uncomfortable part. None of this requires a breach. The liability isn't created when you get attacked. It exists the moment you sign the certification, saying your program is adequate, for a chain you can't see all the way down. So if you can't see it, how do you ever close it? Which brings us to the form, the one with your name on it. Due in April. Every year, a senior officer certifies the cybersecurity program is compliant. Sign. Date it. Personal. That signature is the trap, and it's why you can't contract this away. You can push the work to a vendor. You can't push the certification to them. You sign it. So if examiners later find the gaps, NYDFS says are common, the missing due diligence, the unmonitored subprocessor, that signature converts from a formality into the evidence. You attested it was handled. If the records aren't there, the attestation is the exposure. That's the whole shift. You thought outsourcing moved the risk off your desk. It moved the work off your desk and put a dated, signed attestation on it. And NYDFS built Part 500 to be a model others look to. This is the same arc this channel has tracked through every recent enforcement story. The penalty attaches to the governance failure, not the breach. This is just the first time it follows the data into a company you never hired. And here's where it may be heading. Every penalty in this arc so far hit the company, a corporate fine, paid from a corporate account. The next escalation may not be a bigger fine. So the decision lens is narrow and personal. Could you hand a regulator proof you verified your vendor tomorrow? Not promise it. Produce it. Run everything through one filter. Unverified delegation is retained liability. If you can't show the file, you didn't transfer the risk, you just stopped looking at it. In practice, that means a real record for every critical vendor. The due diligence you ran, the safeguards in the contract, the monitoring that's ongoing, and the senior sign-off that ties it together. If those exist, you're defensible. If they don't, the form you sign in April is the only document that matters, and it's pointing the wrong way. Here's the part that doesn't resolve, and that's the point. You can document every vendor you chose. You cannot fully document the ones they chose. The fourth party stays partly dark, no matter how much diligence you do. The exposure doesn't close. It gets managed, monitored, and signed for, knowing you can't see the bottom of the chain. That's the real shift. NYDFS forced into writing. Outsourcing was supposed to be how you offloaded the risk. It turned out to be how you signed for risk you can't even see. The last firm got fined for the paperwork on its own systems. This is the same regulator, drawing the map to the paperwork on everyone else's. If you want to see where this enforcement logic started, the case where a company did everything technically right and still paid, that's the Delta Dental breakdown. Watch that next. The pattern there is the one now coming for your vendor chain.